All right. Good afternoon. Welcome to our first session of the day, which is entitled Self and Other. I'll be speaking first, and then Professor Crosby. The way this is basically going to work is I'm going to set up some problems that I think the virtue tradition has, and then Professor Crosby is going to show how certain distinctions that von Hildebrand makes provide a solution to that problem. So virtue, as we saw yesterday, has a lot to do with how we treat ourselves and how we treat others. And this naturally leads us to a problem that's sometimes called the problem of egoism and altruism. Otherwise put, perhaps the problem of the self and the other. When I'm seeking to be virtuous, what am I primarily concerned about? Am I primarily concerned about my own good? That is, do I treat you all well so that eventually I'll be happy? As many people seem to think. Or, on the other hand, do I treat others well entirely for their own sake, without any regard for my own happiness? So we've got a problem there of how we're going to relate together virtue, on the one hand, and happiness, both my happiness and that of others, on the other hand. And when I say happiness today, I want to mean it in that really robust sense that Professor Plato talked about yesterday. Not just a momentary feeling of cheerfulness or whatever, but real flourishing, eudaimonia, beatitude, ultimately the beatific vision. So happiness in a really robust sense of flourishing. Like I said, I'm going to set up a problem here. I want to look at two extremes, but they're not all that extreme. We could talk about egoism in a completely selfish sense where I'm just interested in my own pleasure. I don't want to talk about that today. Probably everyone in the room can agree that's not genuine happiness or genuine virtue. On the other hand, I could talk about a sort of naive altruism, sort of philanthropy, being kind to other people. I don't want to talk about that either. I want to talk about versions of egoism and altruism, self-focus and other focus, that are very close to the truth. And by looking at them and seeing the problems with them, we can see what a virtue ethic needs. The first position I want to look at, my representative of an egoist who almost gets things right, is St. Thomas Aquinas. So here we're going to be looking at that virtue ethic tradition that we talked about yesterday. First of all, a little bit of review from yesterday. Remember, Aquinas, following Aristotle, has a teleological, that is, goal-directed action theory. Everything we do is for the sake of our last end, our perfect good. We start with the end in mind, and then we reason back to what are the best means to reach that end. And our ultimate end on this view, of course, is happiness. Happiness being ultimately defined in terms of the beatific vision, this vision of God whereby I am totally fulfilled. But Aquinas makes an important distinction when we're talking about happiness. We can talk about happiness in an objective sense. That means the object that will make us happy. And then we can talk about happiness in a subjective sense. That is, the experience of happiness that I have when I attain that object. So, for example, suppose I think that my happiness consists in eating pizza. Pizza is my objective happiness. It is the good that is sought. And the feeling of delight that I get when I eat pizza is my subjective happiness. And Aquinas emphasizes that the objective happiness is always more important than the subjective happiness. The subjective happiness, the feeling of happiness, the experience of fulfillment and flourishing, that arises on the basis of attaining a certain object. Now, we can apply all this to the case of God, right? On Aquinas' view, God is our genuine happiness. God is our last end. God is the good that is desired, ultimately. In order to be happy, I cannot pursue my own subjective happiness. My goal is not the beatific vision in the sense of a wonderful experience for myself. My goal is God himself, who will make me happy. In order for me to be fulfilled, I must love God for his own sake, and more than I love myself, Aquinas says. So God is not being sought here as a means to my happiness. nor is he even being sought as my individual good, as the thing that fulfills me as an individual. Rather, again, Aquinas introduces an important distinction here between what he calls an individual good and a common good. An individual good is something that is fulfilling to me just as this individual. It's not something that's shareable with others. So go back to my pizza example. Pizza is an individual good. Right? The piece of pizza I eat can only fulfill me. You can have another piece of pizza, but you can't have the one that fulfills me. On the other hand, knowledge about virtue is a common good. A common good is one that is shareable. It's one that can give itself to many and that we pursue as being able to be given to many. So knowledge about virtue is shareable in that sense. I can have knowledge about virtue and you can have the same knowledge at the same time, and it doesn't hurt me in any way for you to know it. And if I'm pursuing knowledge about virtue, I'm pursuing it as something that can be shared by many people. Right? If I were to pursue that knowledge as something entirely for myself, I would have failed to get what knowledge actually is. So common goods are shareable, and they're pursued as shareable. God is a common good in this sense. Okay, so this might sound pretty good. We're pursuing God for his own sake. We're pursuing God as shareable by many. And yet I introduced this view by saying Aquinas' view is egoistical, in a sense. So what's wrong with this view? First problem, and here I want to introduce some terminology from von Hildebrand. This view only recognizes what Hildebrand calls motivation by objective goods. An objective good is a thing that can fulfill someone's nature. When I pursue God, on Aquinas' view, even though I'm pursuing him for his own sake, I am pursuing him as an objective good. That is, as something that has reference to fulfilling my nature and your nature and the nature of the community. There is no genuine, what Hildebrand calls, transcendence on this view. To transcend myself means to go out of myself and approach another entirely for his own sake. Entirely because he has value, that is, importance in himself. So even though I love God more than myself on Aquinas' view, I still love him as fulfilling to me and as fulfilling to the community of which I'm a part, not as valuable entirely in himself. The takeaway from this is that full virtue, I want to argue, depends on having the right motivation. Motivation not just by objective goods, but motivation by value, importance in itself as well. And that requires achieving genuine transcendence, going out and beyond myself. And I believe Dr. Crosby is going to talk more about that in a little bit. Okay, so that's the egoistic extreme, not that far from what I take to be the truth, but still missing some things. Second extreme on the other side, the altruistic extreme, comes from a phenomenological philosopher, Emanuel Levinas, mid-20th century Lithuanian Jewish philosopher, though he lived and wrote in France for his entire career. And I gave you in the packet of readings an interview with my teacher, Richard Cohen, who is my teacher on Levinas, where he sums up Levinas's philosophy quite nicely, I think, in just a couple of pages. So for Levinas, morality and also virtue never arise from myself. On Levinas's view, I am naturally egoistical. I'm naturally self-centered. I'm naturally disposed to care only for myself, my community, those with whom I have something in common. Morality only arises, Levinas thinks, when I encounter another person, when I see the face of another person. When I see the face of another person, especially the face of a suffering person, I am troubled. I realize that I have been self-centered, that I have been, up till now, focused only on my own fulfillment, my own flourishing, my own happiness, maybe even my own moral betterment. But I have failed to transcend myself, to go out of myself and respond to the needs of another. So morality arises when I am troubled in my self-centeredness by encountering another person. Morality here is entirely a matter of self-transcendence. And this beginning of morality, on Levinas's view, is not an intellectual experience. I don't suddenly conceive of the thought, oh, I ought to care for other people. No, it's a sort of bodily being troubled, right? You feel morality in the pit of your stomach, so to speak. I see another person suffering, and it wrenches me out of myself. The face of another person, whether suffering or not, demands a response, and so also demands responsibility, on Levinas's view. So morality here is entirely a matter of transcendence. It's entirely a matter of going out of myself towards the other. And that means, for Levinas, going out of myself to serve the other and never returning to myself. He gives a striking comparison between two figures from the ancient world. He says the Greek moral view, the Greek virtue tradition that we've been looking at up till now, is represented by the figure of Odysseus. Odysseus goes out from his home in Ithaca, he goes off and he fights the Trojan War, and he encounters various people. He helps a number of people, but it's all ultimately for the sake of returning home, that is, returning to himself. Whereas Levinas says his approach, which he takes to be the Jewish approach, is represented by the figure of Abraham. Abraham is called to a higher moral standard, and he is called to leave his home and never return. So likewise, Levinas says, encountering the face of another person calls me to go out of myself and never again worry about my own happiness. Okay, so this clearly includes what was missing in Aquinas' approach. It includes a clear stance of transcending, going out of myself. What's wrong with this view? First of all, this makes morality, it makes virtue entirely a matter of being unsettled, of being troubled in myself. Levinas uses quite extreme language to describe the virtuous person. The virtuous person feels himself as a hostage to the other, he says, entirely possessed by the other, subservient, a slave to the other. That's the condition of the virtuous person on Levinas's view. Virtue is a matter of taking the bread out of my mouth to serve the other. This fails to recognize, I think, the legitimate moral calls that I give to myself. That is, that when I examine myself, I find moral obligation there as well. If we're going to include in our virtue ethic this stance of transcendence, going out from myself, we shouldn't forget about the objective goods. That is, those actions, situations in community, and other goods that fulfill me and fulfill other members of my community. This view of Levinas clearly recognizes value in other persons, but fails to recognize value in myself, which is also something that demands a response. So this extreme altruism that we find in Levinas is too unstable, I think, a view of virtue. So what are we going to do here? We've got a sort of impasse between two approaches, and they can't both be correct, taken in their entirety. Aquinas says, pursue objective goods, common goods, yes. Goods for the community, yes, but always goods, not values. Levinas says, just transcend yourself. Don't worry about your own virtue. Don't worry about your own happiness. To do so is vicious. It fails to respond to the needs of others, which are always greater than your own. The issue here, I think, is we need a virtue ethic that's able to recognize multiple sources of what I'll call normative force. Right? You feel that force of obligation, of moral norms, coming from multiple sources. I find them in myself, in my own pursuit of happiness. I find them in others, and the call that they exert to me to transcend myself. So we need some sort of account that can put these two together without falling into either the egoistic extreme that we find in Aquinas or the altruistic extreme that we find in Levinas. We need a view that recognizes the legitimate claims of both self and other. I'll turn it over to Professor Crosby, who maybe will provide us with that solution.
Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to work closely like this with a former student of mine. I am delighted to be, as you put it, teed up by you, although I must say you saddled me with a pretty big task. And I'm sure to disappoint you, I think, in my fulfillment of it. All right, self and other. I want to turn to von Hildebrand as our main resource for negotiating these difficulties and want to explain to you how it is that he seeks an ethical position, an understanding of virtue that, as he says, is beyond egoism and altruism. Now, that sounds a little strange, the altruism part. We think of egoism as a term of rebuke, but altruism seems to be a term of commendation and praise. So how is it that von Hildebrand wants to go beyond even altruism? Well, let's go back to the beginning of Hildebrand's moral philosophy, and that is found in his understanding of what he calls value response, the point of departure for his moral philosophy. He says in the passage I chose from his book, Liturgy and Personality, the chapter entitled The Spirit of Response to Value in the Liturgy, he says there, the very soul of the response to value is the consciousness that an adequate response is due to each value according to its rank. The idea is that there is a fundamental reverence by which we should approach the world, a reverence that disposes us to notice everything of value or intrinsic worth and be ready to honor that value, giving it its due through our response. I want to show you, in case you don't know it already, a wonderful passage in C.S. Lewis that explains with great clarity this Hildebrandian idea of value and value response. Lewis writes, this is in The Abolition of Man, I'm speaking of the doctrine of objective value, the belief that certain attitudes are really true and others really false to the kind of thing the universe is and the kind of things we are. Those who know the Tao, this Chinese word that he uses for the world of value, can hold that to call children delightful or old men venerable is not simply to record a psychological fact about our own parental or filial emotions, but to recognize a quality which demands a certain response from us, whether we give it or not. And because our approvals and disapprovals are thus recognitions of objective value or responses to an objective order, therefore, emotional states can be in harmony with reason or out of harmony with reason. So, for example, you have a typical value response when encountering another person. You show respect for that person. Respect is due to the person in virtue of his or her dignity. So that respect is a Hildebrandian value response. Or take Socrates, a morally noble person. Due to Socrates is something like admiration or even veneration. That would be a response appropriate to, measured to. who Socrates is morally. Or whenever you love a person, von Hildebrand holds, you have some glimpse of some splendor or beauty of value in the beloved. And you have the consciousness that this person abundantly merits, is worthy of being loved by you. So this is the idea of value response. And as I say, the fundamental value response is for von Hildebrand reverence. That's the fundamental openness to things of intrinsic worth, the fundamental readiness to give things their due. I wanted to show you in the same chapter from the Liturgy and Personality, von Hildebrand's description of the contrast between value response and its opposite. One of the most essential elements of true personality, he says, is the consciousness that we owe to values a due response. By this, the theocentric man is distinguished from the egocentric one. Shut up in himself, the egocentric man is incapable of this self-abandon. He is incapable of giving himself up to the world of meaning and value, simply for its own sake, and for no other reason, in unison with the objective logos. The purely egocentric man, dominated by pride and concupiscence, is generally blind to values, has no contact with them and their inner life, and is also without contact with God, who includes all values. The proud man is hostile to values. The concupiscent man is indifferent to them. And he wants to say that by contrast, it is the reverent man who is awakened and alive to them and who orders his life in terms of giving, as von Hildebrand says, the world of values what is due to it. As Mark mentioned, this idea of value response, since it's right at the center of von Hildebrand's moral philosophy, brings a strong stress on transcendence, self-transcendence, into his ethics. When I see something worthy in itself and am drawn to give it its due, I go beyond myself. The egocentric type whom he describes remains stuck altogether in himself. But this living by a certain transcendence, participating through value response in the world of value, that transcendence was very important to von Hildebrand. And he puts it right at the center of his moral philosophy. Now, let's go back to this issue of altruism. You might say that the ethics of value response, as so far described, seems to make the Hildebrandian ethics a kind of altruistic ethics, other-centered, going beyond myself, loving the good for its own sake. Isn't that a kind of altruism? Why then does he want to develop a position beyond altruism? Well, von Hildebrand holds that the moral life, formed as it is by value response, must not be thought of as consisting exclusively in value response. That would lead to a serious distortion of the moral life. He speaks of a depersonalized objectivism that would result if it were always only value and giving it its due that was the drive behind my moral action. Von Hildebrand asks, in effect, what about my well-being, my flourishing, my authentic happiness? What about that care of the soul that we were speaking of in connection with Socrates yesterday? These things, like the care of the soul, do not involve the same gesture of transcendence, going beyond myself. They don't even look altruistic. This care for oneself has a certain self-referential structure that distinguishes it from that glorious self-transcendence of value response. And yet, von Hildebrand very rightly sees that the concern with my own real happiness and my own well-ordered soul is a fundamental part of a well-ordered moral life. I'm morally bound to care for my soul. And this concern with what's really beneficial for me is nothing egocentric. It doesn't appeal to pride and concupiscence. It should not be run together with that gross egocentrism that you just heard in that previous passage. So von Hildebrand came to hold, for all of the celebration of value response and the transcendence of it, he came to see that you can't talk about virtue using only, exclusively, the idea of value and value response. There are also things that are objectively beneficial for the person. So that expresses something different from his value, which is an intrinsic splendor or worth. There are also things objectively beneficial. For instance, my bodily health, or my mental health, or my education. These things, I seek them under the aspect of them being beneficial for me. So it's not only this outward turning gesture of value response that is at stake when I pursue these things beneficial for myself. So for von Hildebrand, it would be a bad altruism, a disordered, unnatural, unlivable, depersonalized altruism, if I left out of the moral life all of these things beneficial for me and somehow stamped them all as just a matter of egocentric interest and led my moral life exclusively in terms of value response. So we have to think of the moral life also in terms of those goods that are beneficial for us. And this is a move von Hildebrand makes, I think, clearly in contrast from Levinas, as you presented him, Mark. So von Hildebrand secures his understanding of virtue against a certain one-sided altruism just by acknowledging these things beneficial for the person and refusing to collapse them into things, objects of mere selfish, grasping interest. Now, I want at this point to go back to our discussion yesterday about the moral life and how it's grounded in an understanding of the human person. And I want to show you how von Hildebrand articulates the understanding of the human person, who is both capable of this self-transcendence of value response, but also of seeking his own well-ordered flourishing. In an extremely significant passage in his work, The Nature of Love, he makes this statement about the vision of the human person that underlies this value-responding but not exclusively altruistic ethics of von Hildebrand. And I'm going to read some sentences. If you have the text in front of you, it's pages 45 and 46 in the pages that Catherine added. But I'll read it slowly, take it in. It's, for understanding the Hildebrandian ethics, I think, one of the most seminal passages of all. He says, there are two fundamental misunderstandings of man and of his nature and dignity as person. One of them goes in the direction of obscuring his transcendence, holding that man is in principle incapable of taking an interest in something, having value in itself, but that he can only be moved to something by something beneficial for himself. The opposite misunderstanding consists in thinking that man achieves his full destiny when he no longer has any beneficial goods for himself, when he has become indifferent to his happiness or unhappiness, to the point of living only by pure value response. Well, that's the disordered altruism, though he doesn't use that term here. On this view, I am thought to remain locked in my immanence if I take an interest in something beneficial for myself. Both conceptions, he goes on, and because of the importance of the passage, I'm going to read a few more sentences, if you will permit me to do that. Both conceptions of the human person are disastrous errors. Whoever does not acknowledge the transcendence of human beings fails to understand what distinguishes them as persons from all impersonal creatures. But whoever smells something egocentric in the fact that I desire an objective good for myself, whoever thinks that the ideal of human life is for me to lose all interest in beneficial goods for myself, fails to understand the character of man as subject. He fails to see the mysterious center to which everything in the life of a person is referred, the center that is addressed by beneficial goods, and that is inseparably bound up with his dignity as person. And just this conclusion, if the first error locks persons in themselves, and in this way distorts their ultimate relation to the world and to God, the second error deprives them of their character as full selves. The first error reduces man to the biological, taking him according to the model of a plant or animal. The second error robs him of his character as a full subject and destroys the personal in him by exaggerating the objective to the point of dissolving that which makes him a subject. So that's the disordered altruism that Van Hildebrand wants to move far beyond. We have to keep clear of both errors, he ends by saying. He here introduces also a term new in his philosophy to express this concern, this center in man which is appealed to by beneficial goods. He speaks of the Eigenleben, which means in German something like the life of one's own self. I translated it as subjectivity in translating the book. But the idea is, for Van Hildebrand, that the human person is structured by a certain polarity. There is this polarity of this inner center, appealed to by what is beneficial, appealed to by happiness. And then there is this pole of self-transcendence. And so there's a kind of polarity of, well, it's self and other, the inner self on the one hand, and the self-transcending self on the other. And the full Hildebrandian vision of the human person, underlying his moral philosophy and his philosophy of value, is this polar structure of Eigenleben, or being a being of one's own, concerned with oneself, and being a being with this vocation to self-transcendence in value response. Now, I want to, how is my time marked? Do I have? Yes, it's running out fast. Let me just conclude by mentioning the way in which von Hildebrand analyzes the interrelation between these two poles. He throws tremendously much light on all those ethical questions mentioned by Mark. So he says that there is the danger that this concern with my Eigenleben, with my own flourishing, interferes with the self-transcendence. That drive to self-transcendence is inhibited by a disordered preoccupation with my Eigenleben. And that is the thing that he typically combats under the rubric of eudaimonism, a concern with my well-being and my happiness that somehow plays out as compromising the full self-transcendence of value response. But there's also the other danger of my concern with transcendence suffocating the very morally necessary concern with my Eigenleben. And he points in one place to a very interesting case of a kind of religiously driven depreciation of my Eigenleben. He says, and perhaps many of you from your religious upbringing have encountered this in some way or other. Many devout people think, well, this concern with what's beneficial for me, that's after all nothing other than something selfish. And if I really want to be perfect, then I'll renounce that concern for what's beneficial for me. And I'll order my life exclusively in terms of value response. And though von Hildebrand was such an ardent Catholic and a great religious writer, he has no patience at all for this this suffocation of, or depreciation of Eigenleben. And in fact, he makes a great point of the fact that Christ in Gethsemane, when he asks the cup to be taken away, if that be the will of the Father, shows a sensitivity to what is harmful and dreadful for him, and that it would not be any more perfect if a follower of his were to say, well, I don't care how dreadful the suffering is, it doesn't count, it doesn't matter. What's good for me is all an issue of selfishness. So von Hildebrand thinks that even the most ardent religious aspirations to serve God and serve the good should never come at the expense of one's Eigenleben, of this concern for what is really beneficial for oneself. So I will leave it at that. There's also the case, but being out of time, I won't press it, where he studies a kind of interpenetration of this concern with one's Eigenleben and with transcending oneself. So there's no illegitimate interference of one with the other, but a happy unity and a certain coinciding of the two. We can look into those cases in the discussion. Thank you.